interesting thing, isn't it, Michael, that during the war, in Australia, we actually made our own tanks.
Yes, yeah. I think that's another facet. I mean, how many things have we got time to talk about today? We're only going to scrape the surface, but just look at the enormous range of development.
Let's just look at Frank first.
You're live on Channel 7 across Australia. What's the day feel like to you?
I'm even older than the car, Frank.
Where were you 50 years ago?
50 years ago, I was in Borneo.
How long after then did you get home?
I didn't get home till about the end of September.
Right, so this is really the first occasion you have had to participate in a VP march.
Oh, in a VP march, but we've had... Yes, as a unit, yes. We must have the Anzac Day, of course, Frank.
But the crowd's brilliant.
Absolutely wonderful. The crowd, they're really terrific.
They've remembered you.
Yes, thank you very much, Frank.
Enjoy the day.
We're the 2nd 33rd Austrian Battalion.
And proud of it.
Yeah, 7 deep, yeah. Righto, mate. Thank you.
Enjoy it.
God bless you.
He's having a ball, and it is his first victory parade. But Michael McKernan, we were talking about how Australia actually got behind the war effort, even to the extent of heavy industry. We made our own tanks.
Yes, the manufacturing industry in Australia, of course, was very small before the war began, and enormous effort went into the creation of a whole range of munitions and other war requirements. Just think for a moment of women working in those munitions factories. You know, they couldn't have anything that was flammable, so their shoes had leather nails rather than steel nails. Their hair was completely enclosed. Their uniform was right over their hands and so on, so that nothing could get in the way. And they worked in very primitive circumstances. We're talking about factories that hadn't existed before the war, that were hurriedly erected to make, as you say, Dennis, these large objects. And these people worked hour after hour to get the requirements through to the troops. And Australia, of course, became a very significant supply for the entire Pacific War effort, both in armaments and also in foodstuffs, more importantly in foodstuffs. The incredible capacity of the Americans to make things couldn't be matched in Australia. But what Australians did, they did with a devotion and a determination.
In a small munitions factory during the war years, a woman called Peggy Grant assembled hand grenades. She was my mum. Thanks, Mum.
Just pause for a moment to hear that cheering. It's so loud.
I really think that the turnout here has taken everybody by surprise. It's remarkable. It's almost like an Anzac Day parade, isn't it? That there's so many people marching in their own units and...
not necessarily the solemnity of an Anzac Day parade, more the celebratory aspect, isn't it?
I think that's
today?
so. Yes, I'm sure that's so. And just a general feeling of everybody being involved. And of course, that's the way it was during the war.
Frank's got a digger down there. Come on in, Frank.
We're live on Channel 7 across Australia. Where were you this day 50 years ago?
I was in Atherton dancing up the streets, was on shift when peace was declared.
So the whole of Australia broke out and enjoyed it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
What was your contribution to the war effort?
I was in special wireless signals and interception, working in intercepting our signals.
That would have been a fascinating job.
It was a fascinating job. It was all very secret at the time.
Well, I won't ask you too much. I'll let you enjoy the day because the crowds are huge, aren't they?
Lovely. It's absolutely wonderful, Frank.
Frank Warwick, who's joining in the march with the diggers. I've got some more disabled veterans in some of the period vehicles. Look at all that ticker tape.
They're just great blokes, aren't they? The Prime Minister's here as he should be, paying tribute to Australia's finest, to a generation who brought us peace and brought us prosperity.
And yesterday, of course, he paid tribute to the Pacific Island nations who joined us in battle during the Second World War.
Yes, and it was a good speech from the Prime Minister yesterday. Sometimes his speeches don't necessarily hit the mark, but yesterday the words were right and his delivery was just spot on. He paid a welcome tribute to our neighbours, our near neighbours, and how important they were. As he put it, all of them were threatened, some of them were occupied.
To see that the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels got a bit of a win today.
Yes, as they should. I don't think there's a great deal of work being done in Brisbane this morning. And that's how it should be, because Australia is remembering.
We'll be back after the break with more of Australia Remembers here in Brisbane.
And now our men and women will come home. Our fighting men with battle honours thick upon them from every theatre of war.
This is Brisbane. It's August the 15th, 1995. Those scenes just a second ago from Brisbane, 1945. The bands are here, the crowds are here in huge numbers. Nobody expected a roll-up quite like this. This is Australia remembering. This is for the national celebration. Michael McKernan is the Deputy Director of the Australian War Memorial, and I think one of Australia's finest war historians. Michael, we've just seen go past Australia's 8th Division. Tragedy stalked the 8th Division, but glory too.
Yes, the 8th Division was sent to Malaya to protect and defend and prevent the Japanese movement down there. They fought with incredible bravery against an enemy that was clearly superior in jungle fighting techniques and in training, and they endured the humiliation of capture at Singapore. Of course, Singapore fell on the 15th of February 1942. In that campaign, the 8th Division lost 1,789 men killed and 15,395 captured. An awful, awful tragedy. And of course, the prisoners who were taken in February 1942 endured 3.5 years of captivity in conditions, as we know, of great brutality, degradation, inhumanity and atrocity. I don't think I'll ever forget being at Sandakan a few weeks ago and feeling the spirit of the Australians who were slaughtered there and on the death march to Ranau.
Frank Warwick is in the parade.
Good morning, sir. You're live on Channel 7 across Australia. Where were you on VP Day?
I was up at WWII.
How long after that did you get back to Australia?
4 months.
So this is a pretty moving experience for you today, sir?
It certainly is.
What are your thoughts at this time?
Overwhelming. I just can't believe it all. It's remarkable reception. It's incredible.
There's a lot of sadness in your voice.
Well, I think you can't help it. It makes you think.
It does, sir, and the people have come back to think and remember.
That's right.
Thank you, sir. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Memories, of course, will be tinged with sadness. We're entitled to that. A lot of good Australians never came back. But today, we remember them as we remember the great victory that brought the great peace.
Michael McKernan, a lot of the diggers do seem to be very old. How many diggers served in both wars? Well,
if we're talking about the First World War, we're talking about 330,000 Australians who served overseas. If we're talking about the soldiers alone from the Second World War, we're talking of more than 500,000 Australian soldiers who served overseas. An enormous number of Australian men and women during the Second World War in uniform, nearly 1 million, of a population of just over 7 million. You can see what contribution this country made.
So certainly there could have been an overlap there. Okay, well, Adelaide's going to start their march in a moment. So we're going to leave Adelaide now. But Australia remembers, 50 years on after victory in the Pacific.
And in Brisbane, they are here in huge numbers. Look at those kids.
And there's another flyover. What sort of planes are these? Michael, you know?
They went too fast for me, Christine.
There we are. Come on, Dennis, you're the...
Well, I think one of them sounds like a Harvard. A Harvard was an American aircraft, which I'm very familiar with the sound of it because I grew up under the flight path of an airbase that had Harvards there. And for many, many years, my adolescent dreams were punctuated by the sounds of Harvards.
There we are. We're hearing it's a Mustang. It's a Mustang. And the Sea Fury. Well, there we are. The Sea Fury was used in the Korean War of aircraft carriers.
And by those who flew them, they are very, very highly regarded aircraft.
And that Mustang that we saw was owned and flown by retired squadron leader Jeff Trappett, who's head of the Roulettes.
We just saw a glimpse of a young girl in a nurse's uniform, and I think it's appropriate to think about the nurses a bit. Of course, Australian Army nurses of all the services have always accompanied their troops overseas. When we were in Crete a little while ago, we had a nurse with us, and it's been thought that nurses, weren't in the front line. There was no hiding from the front line in Crete, and the nurses who were there were right in the thick of the action, as they were in Greece as they retreated through Greece. And I think it's true to say that all Australians wanted to be nursed by Australian nurses. It's such a terrific morale booster for them.
Well, sorry, Dennis, I was just going to point out the St Lawrence's College Marching Band, which was reformed in the tradition of the College Cadet Band of earlier years. And this band has participated in the St Patrick's Day Parade, the Anzac Day March, and in a march celebrating 100 years of Catholic education, and they're joining us today.
Frank's flicking them out. Here
Sir,
we go,
you're live on Channel 7 across Australia. What are your thoughts as you participate today?
Very nice indeed.
Where were you 50 years ago?
Launceston, Tasmania.
Right. And what about you, sir, next door? What's this day mean to you?
West Australia. The Eagles.
The crowds are marvellous, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Very nice indeed.
We have a couple of ladies right behind you. The day special for you?
Yes, it is. I was in the Red Cross during the war, and we were at the National Bank building opposite the General Post Office. And
well, Australia certainly has remembered you and everybody else today.
Yes, thank you. Nice to see you.
You too.
Australia is indeed remembering, and Michael McKernan, a distinguished historian, is with us today. In the crowd, Michael, there somewhere, are the men of the 39th Battalion. Those ragged, bloody heroes, they were called. Tell us their story.
They were militia troops. They were sent to Port Moresby to resist the Japanese and then fought on the Kokoda track. They were brilliantly led by Colonel Ralph Honour, a very distinguished soldier who had served in the Middle East and had come back. He was a genius as a leader. He had a company in that battalion who weren't working well, who were giving him trouble, and he put them in the post of honour. He didn't hide them, he didn't put them in the back, he put them in the post of honour because he knew that if challenged properly, they would come good. The 39th Battalion suffered enormous losses. They fought in conditions of the utmost difficulty. We've seen pictures of the conditions on the Kokoda track, the pudding-like mud up to the knees through which men walked, fighting an unseen enemy hidden in the jungle, at any stage likely to be shot from a sniper, and yet they knew what they were doing. They fought devotedly for Australia, and when they were relieved after Boona, they were to walk back. One of the people said, "We'll pick up the stragglers by car." And Honour said, "There are no stragglers in the 39th Battalion," and they all marched proudly to the parade, to the airfield. It took them a day and a half or 2 days to do so. And as they marched on to the airfield, somebody said, "What's that mob?" And the second in command said, "This is no mob, this is the 39th Battalion."
The 39th. They fought their way up, they fought their way back. Bill and Alice Hayden are enjoying things here today. This is Australia remembering. This is the National March. We're in Brisbane. We're having a ball.
They are coming home to a peace which has to be won.
Welcome back to Brisbane. 50 years celebrating and commemorating victory in the Pacific. Dr. Michael McKernan's with us now from the Australian War Memorial. And Michael, why Brisbane? Why is it the focus of the national celebration and commemoration?
Yes, it's not the most obvious thing first up, is it? But this, of course, was where General MacArthur had his headquarters, and this was therefore the nerve centre of the operation of the Pacific War. MacArthur, of course, was the commander of the Southwest Pacific Command, and also, of course, all troops that were going forward probably came through here. There was an enormous number of American troops stationed in Brisbane. Brisbane was a pretty small branch office town, if it can be put that way. It isn't now, of course, it's a magnificent city, but it was a small town in those days. And you can imagine the change that it made to Brisbane to have these enormous numbers of troops coming in. Blamey was here, MacArthur was here. It really was the place where everything was happening.
And of course the imaginary Brisbane line.
Well, so they talk about. There was a lot of political controversy about that the plans for the defence of Australia would be focused on the Sydney-Melbourne region, and that anything north of Brisbane would be lost. I think they were probably plans made in pretty dark days. I mean, they were also talking about the scorched earth policy. I mean, wharves and so on were being drilled for explosives. There were a whole series of plans to deny the Japanese the supply that they might have had they landed here, and the Brisbane line, it seems to be, fitted into that type of defensive strategy.
The occupation forces, the troops who went into Japan after the war and did marvellous reconstruction work. Frank is down there. I think he's got some diggerettes with him.
Look at this, streamers, ticker tape and bunting. There's a great pile of it. It's everywhere, and enjoying the parade today. Large numbers of children. Your name's Adam, I think, Adam? Yeah. Just as well it is, or I'm in trouble. What does the day mean, Adam? How's it been explained to you?
The war finishing in the Pacific 50 years ago.
Right. Have you had a day off school to come up here and cheer and clap today?
Yeah.
Did it make you feel proud to see the old fighting people, the old servicemen and women?
Yeah.
They did a good thing for your country?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll let you enjoy the day. And the people around, too, there are huge crowds. You can see them behind us here. They go back, 10, 12 deep. I'll keep out of their way or I'll get shouted down for blocking their view. But the mood here, the feeling is absolutely wonderful, as Australia certainly does remember.
Frank Warwick at the march in Brisbane, and the women are marching here today. The women who forced their way into the war. The military didn't particularly want them. The political establishment tried to ignore them, but they couldn't, because they volunteered in huge numbers. And their contribution was as strong and as dignified as any in Australia. Frank Warwick's been
surrounded.
Right, you're live on television across Australia, so behave yourselves. What does the day mean to you?
Wonderful. Means peace. Absolutely fabulous. I couldn't march. I couldn't join in 50 years ago because I was pregnant 6 months.
Well, I see. And does the day mean something special to you?
Fabulous, absolutely fabulous.
Where were you in the war?
I was in Cairns and Townsville.
Well, you've missed all your mates. You better run and catch up to them. Good to see you.
Frank Warwick, and I don't think he's even got a pair of silk stockings.
I'm having a whale of a time. Bye-bye, Jim. Behave yourself, Jim. I'm mucking up, but that doesn't matter.
I'll catch up to your mates.
Dancing in the streets again, 50 years on.
Now, Michael, Controversy Corner. Just before, as you were telling us of the heroic exploits of the 39th Militia, you referred constantly to the place as the Kokoda Track. A lot of Australians call it the Kokoda Trail. Who's right?
No one's right, Dennis. I think it is now, I think, the word trail is used. But track's such a good Australian word. And if you go back to the diggers themselves and ask them, they'll invariably speak of track. Ralph Honour always spoke of the Kokoda Track. It's just an Australian word. I wonder whether trail, being much more an American word, wasn't a bit of an attempt to show that the Americans were there too. And, you know, the hard work was done by the Australians fighting there, and they weren't recognised at the time. There was a lot of, unfortunately, petty jealousy, of lack of recognition, and even from Australia's top commanders who did not appreciate the difficulty of the terrain and what had been achieved. So it seems to me it's a good Australian word. It was a very good Australian battle. Let's call it track.
The Kokoda Track it is. Michael McKernan, the Deputy Director of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. And he's joining us today as we join thousands and thousands who are marching through Brisbane to remember the effort, to remember the sacrifice. Australian Army bands up there. We've seen some great bands today. Michael, what do bandsmen do during the war?
They act as stretcher bearers, Dennis, and of course when we look at a band as good as this, we're looking at very good musicians, but they are also trained soldiers. They know how they would take their place on a battlefield. And just mentioning stretcher bearers, of course, makes us remember the really hard work that those men did.
Well, behind the band, the serving personnel, and as we watch those march past, let's go to a break and we'll be back with more of Australia Remembers 50 years on.
At this moment, let us offer thanks to God. Let us remember those whose lives were given that we may enjoy this glorious moment.
Across Australia, we're live. This is Australia Remembers. This is the National March in Brisbane, but we're across Australia with this coverage. The Seven Network has embraced Australia Remembers from day one. We've been there along every single track, every single part. Tonight, there'll be full coverage of what's happening across this great country as it celebrates on the 7 Nightly News, and of course, special reports. What happened in your state on Today Tonight? There's the salvos again, always a salvo, and thank God for them too. Here in Brisbane, the turnout has been just huge. Nobody expected these numbers. We're talking here thousands and thousands of people marching, thousands and thousands of people watching and joining in a celebration. The weather's been kind to us. The organisers have done themselves proud. It's a great show.
It's terrific that rain that was forecast is held off. It's been very, very pleasant.
I had a word with him, Chris, and he turned it off for the day.
No soggy ticker tape. Again, some of those period vehicles transporting the disabled veterans so they can take part in today's march. Well,
of course, this is the coverage here in Brisbane. Thousands of people turning out. But across Australia, they're remembering. In Victoria, they're remembering one of their favourite sons. A man we now sadly lost a couple of years ago, but the Premier down there, Jeff Kennett, has been unveiling a memorial to WWII Dunlop. He was the prisoner of war doctor. Michael McKernan, tell us about WWII Dunlop.
Well, as you say, he was a doctor. He a very keen military man too, and he enlisted from England in the AIF. Now that's fairly unique, but he was so desperately keen to get involved. He went into captivity with the others in February 1942, and then his real work began. We've heard about the conditions on the railway. We've read the stories of the awful labour, the back-breaking labour that these men had to be engaged in, and the terrible diseases and illnesses that they picked up. WWII had no medicines, he had nothing, and yet he performed operations, he worked as a doctor, and he was supported by many other doctors too. They worked in awful conditions. The men were operated on without anaesthetic. They were everything that could be done to keep them going.
That's a Douglas DC-3 Dakota.
And how those men on the railway would have loved to have heard the sound of that plane bringing some medical supplies to them. But that, of course, was impossible. So WWII was operating in the most appalling circumstances. He was deeply loved by the troops for the sacrifice, the determination, the continuation of his medical work. His entire care was for his men. And then, of course, when war ended, he became a great friend of the peoples amongst whom he lived. And again, I mean, a humanitarian unlike many that this nation has produced. A man whose entire life was spent giving for others. That statue that we just saw unveiled represents, I think, all the doctors, but preeminently a man who gave everything he had for this nation through his entire life. And those who met him, and I was lucky enough to do so, remember him as a man of the greatest dignity and the greatest kindness and the greatest humility.
Well, he certainly personifies all that is good in war, and Frank's down there on the ground among some of the diggers who would have remembered Frank.
Live across Australia on Channel 7. What are your feelings at this moment?
Oh, I think it's a great day, and I'm pleased with the number of people who've turned out. Really wonderful.
Were you in Australia on VP Day?
Yes.
Whereabouts?
I was wandering around here, but I live at Springwood.
Were you celebrating here 50 years ago today?
Oh, yes.
And what was the feeling that day?
Oh, it was a wonderful feeling. I can't forget, I'm English, but I can't forget all the Aussies I was with. Wonderful blokes.
And they've all come back again today?
Yes, they're pretty well all here.
Enjoy the day, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. I haven't been called sir, since I left the RAF.
And they've all come back today, and so have the memories. Just talking about Dr. Weary Dunlop, one of the chilling exhibits of Australia's National War Memorial in Canberra, are the surgical devices that were used on the prisoners. Michael, every time I go there, you work at the War Memorial, but every time I go there, my blood runs cold when I see the simple, utterly unsophisticated, homemade surgical equipment that they had to work on.
Yeah. And when you think of the operations that they were doing, so many of them, of course, were tropical ulcers that really got right into the skin and through. And they were digging those ulcers out with, as you say, the most primitive implements. And the men were enduring this without anaesthetic. And yet, WWII saved countless lives, and so did all the other doctors in the prisoner of war camp and on the railway.
Michael, it's fitting on this day that we should reflect for a moment about our National Memorial. It is, of course, an extraordinary institution for all Australians, and I heartily recommend that every Australian should try and get to it at least once in their lives. But what of the future of the memorial, Michael? What sort of place should it be in, say, 20 years' time?
Dennis, it's got to be a place where people can really learn and are stimulated to learn. It's a place that, as you say, has a magnificent collection, but that collection has to be displayed in ways that people are going to come to and learn from. It is a most important institution in Australia. It's got to present its message in ways that people today will be attracted to. For that reason, the memorial embarked on a capital appeal about 12 months ago. We first targeted the federal, state and territory governments and the businesses, and we have done very well. Last Friday, the Prime Minister opened the public appeal phase of the capital appeal, and we're now appealing to Australians all across the land to give what they can to ensure that the memorial is relevant and remains as great as it can be and has been. We're looking for $20 million. There'll be coupons in most of the major newspapers published today that people can use, or they can ring the the toll-free number 1-800-6400-44 to give their donation, however small or however large, because it is going to ensure that the Australian War Memorial continues the work that these people today in their thousands are demonstrating and showing. And if we ever lose this, we're going to be so much a poorer nation.
Well, there's a way that Australia won't forget. Put your hand in your pocket. Corporate Australia, private Australia. Let's do it for the War Memorial. It serves all Australians. It teaches us to remember.
Here we're remembering the RWAF. Just gone by, and now some more disabled veterans who are being carried by the period vehicles. Ticker tape still raining down from all the city buildings.
But you actually wonder where they've got it all from. It's just been a constant waterfall of paper, hasn't it, the entire procession?
Now Frank's down there amongst all that ticker tape, and he's about to get into a truck. Where are you, Frank?
I'm here, Christine, and we're moving along with the procession. You're live on Channel 7. What are your feelings on this day?
Magnificent. We were in New Guinea when the war finished, and we're just glad to be home celebrating.
Of course, that means you wouldn't have been able to join in the celebrations 50 years ago.
We didn't come home till March 1946.
How long after the end of the war did you actually find out it had finished?
Actually, the day before.
Oh, you had advance notice. You must have been thrilled at the size of the crowd here today.
Absolutely, yes.
Here's a friend of yours over there.
Yes, Amy Taylor is one of the officials here. I said I'd give her away.
Well, I'm sure she appreciated it. Enjoy your day.
I'd like to say hello to all the other ex-AWAs.
I'm sure they would.
Particularly the 300 of us who went to New Guinea.
I'm sure they would return it. Thank you very much indeed.
Frank,
and we'll let the parade move on.
Frank, just stay with us for a moment. You're a Brisbane lad. I'm mobbing you down there. Tell me, what was it like after the war years, growing up in Brisbane with all those memories of all the Americans here?
Actually, I can see Frank down there, and he can't hear over that band, Dennis. We might have to come back to him later on that one. And there we are, the General Reserve Band on their way past. A thumbs up and a big smile from that veteran.
Some of them are wearing berets, Michael. What does that imply?
Well, that's a particular corps or unit. I can't quite see that
it's
one.
It's a red beret.
Yeah.
The back there.
They,
these are the RWAF veterans.
I think they're paratroopers with the red berets.
Here, right.
Yeah. Australia had a rather marvellous paratroop regiment led by Sir John Overall, who went on to be the driving force behind the design of the city of Canberra. He was a rather marvellous soldier. He fought in the Middle East and then on Borneo. Sir John and his paratroopers were on standby for the order to move in to evacuate Australian prisoners in Sandakan and Borneo. The order, sadly, never came. Historians argue about that. They argue that MacArthur didn't make available the aircraft for the Australians to fly in because he had more pressing needs further up, perhaps up in the Philippines. We'll never know. The effect of it was that it didn't happen. And sadly, many Australians, good Australians, died. Today we remember them. Here in Brisbane, across the country, Australia's remembering unprecedented scenes here. And we'll be back to Brisbane, across Australia. This day, Australia is remembering.
And now our men and women will come home. Our fighting men with battle honours thick upon them from every theatre of war.
Brisbane, commemorating and celebrating the end of the war, victory in the Pacific, 50 years on. And we've just been joined by viewers in Perth. Welcome to you. And Dennis Grant is with me now. Dennis, what was the significance of Western Australia during the Second World War?
The fear, Christine, I think, was that age-old problem, the tyranny of distance. It was a long way from the eastern seaboard where the war was being prosecuted. The remoteness of parts of Western Australia came into stark contrast. We should never forget that Port Hedland was one of the towns bombed by the Japanese. Joining us this morning on this broadcast in Brisbane is the Deputy Director of the Australian War Memorial, Dr. Michael McKernan. Michael, the war in the West, how was it fought? What were their fears? What were their problems?
Well, as you say, Dennis, the isolation, I think, is the most important thing. Perth was such a long way away. It was physically very hard to get to. And the people in Perth really did feel very remote from the rest of Australia. They also suffered some tremendous tragedy over there with the loss of HMAS Sydney off the coast of Western Australia, particularly off the coast of Perth. We were talking before about some of the chilling things in the Australian War Memorial. Think of the Carly float in the War Memorial, the only surviving item from a warship that held so many men and that had seen such distinguished service for Australia. There's a veteran over in Perth that I'm thinking of, Vic Gibson, who was on the European pilgrimage earlier this year. He was on the HMAS Sydney and recalled vividly when we were in Alexandria, steaming into Alexandria after the Sydney had sunk the Bartolomeo Colleone. And he told me that it was one of the proudest moments of his life. Now, he was taken off the Sydney to go to Britain to train elsewhere, and the Sydney came back to Australian waters and was, of course, sunk with the loss of all aboard at the end of 1941. So it's a place, I suppose, that we think of particularly today, that greatest tragedy, the greatest naval tragedy that Australia has experienced.
Let's look back at the parade here in Brisbane, and we just saw a couple of military-issue Harley-Davidsons, and now we're looking at some Studebaker trucks. One of them apparently is going to be towing a gun. What was the role of the Harley-Davidson motorbikes during this, the gun there?
Yes, well, I mean, transport is one of the prime requirements in war. It's interesting, isn't it? When you think of, we were talking before about the Malayan campaign, and everybody anticipated that the Japanese had come through in huge mechanised divisions and so on, and they actually came through on push bikes, cyclists. And of course this disrupted planning and thinking. A mobile force is the most important aspect of fighting, and though no Australians went to war on motorcycles, certainly in terms of communication they were terribly important. Another item that I'm thinking of in the War Memorial, talking about cycles, are those Italian fold-up cycles that they used in the desert, and then when they couldn't use them, they actually concertinaed them and carried them. Incredible to think of, and it doesn't sound all that
in the desert, that's right.
But very important.
Here come the Yanks, and of course our diggers used to say they were overpaid, they were oversexed, they were over here.
Over here. They took quite a few of the women back with them.
Yes, indeed they did. You can make those comments about the Americans, Dennis, but it's exactly the same things were said of the Australians in England in the First World War. So I think it's a part of war. But many of them so much enjoyed their service in Australia, and they're getting a terrific welcome this morning, aren't they?
Is Frank down there amongst them? Frank, are you down there? Oh, there he is. Come on, Frank.
Go on, Frank, grab a Yank.
We were live on Channel 7 across Australia. Were you here on VP Day?
I was not. I was in the Atlantic.
Right. What's it like to join in the celebration today?
Very much. It's a great, great thrill.
But of course, there were many, many thousands of our countrymen based here in the last war.
Yes, and I flew with Australians in Korea and in Vietnam.
Well, Australia has remembered today, and thank you for being part of the celebration.
Thank you, sir.
They were here in huge numbers, and today, at this national celebration in Brisbane, they're getting a huge response. crowds here much bigger than anyone expected. 25-odd thousand marching, thousands. Look, the 10, the 20 deep on the footpaths here.
And isn't it hard to believe that they've been clapping these veterans for a couple of hours and no letting up? They're just giving everyone such a welcome.
That's Ed Perkins on screen. He's the US ambassador in Canberra, and he's a wonderful, wonderful man. Great ambassador for his country.
And with a distinguished service record himself.
What did he do?
Thank you. He was in the Korean War for memory. Very interested in Australia's military history and a very frequent visitor at the War Memorial. Very eager to learn about Australia's part in war.
Very proud man today.
He would be indeed. Very pleased to welcome some of his American citizens here.
And we're hearing the refrain, and rather loud it is too, of the John Paul College Band. Brisbane, commemorating victory in the Pacific 50 years on. Please join us after the break. In the Pacific, that was then, this is now. 50 years on, and Brisbane is celebrating and commemorating. And it's a parade that's been going for a couple of hours now. The enthusiasm is enormous. Even the sun's decided to come out again. And we haven't seen any of that rain that was forecast. Now here we have the Redeemer College student production of 1945. 35 dancers on the streets there taking part, and on the back of the Bedford truck we've got 6 singers.
Looks like a good show.
Yeah.
Certainly does.
Nothing like a sparkly costume to get you in, Den.
How did the troops organise their entertainment, Michael?
Yeah. Well, they stood in awe of what the Americans could do. That's the first point. The Americans, of course, produced wonderful shows and brought huge numbers of entertainers to Australia. You know, the Hollywood names that you'd never have got here for any other reason were coming out here. Bob Hope, obviously, everybody knows about him, but singers and a whole range of people were coming out here. Australian entertainment tended to be a little bit less impressive. I think one of the interesting...
That's a bit controversial.
Oh, well, I didn't mean to be unkind, but I don't think we had the same big names that you could point to, although, of course, a lot of work was done. But when you look at the prison camps again, just to go to that, the entertainments that people put on there to keep their morale up, great stuff, and the writing that they did, and the way that they knew that... Oh, here he is.
No,
it's the dancing man.
This is Ern.
You see, when you've got an entertainer like that, you don't need big names.
We'll talk about Ern a little bit later on, but he was... isn't that a great comment on Australia? That one bloke claims to be the dancing man, next minute we've got a whole busload of
19 of them, that's right.
It just was that the cameras were all over Sydney, I think it'd be fair to say.
This is a reminder, this is a multicultural Australia that we now have. Peace brought us that. In a sense, it was the dividend, the vast southern Mediterranean migrations who came here. People like this, proud warrior from the former Yugoslavia. Divided, of course, during war. New Zealanders spent a great deal of time fighting up there alongside the various combatants in the former Yugoslavia in the Balkans. We are reminded that Australia is a multicultural place, not least because the minister who's guided this whole program through this year, Con Shaka, is himself a Sicilian. He came to Australia because his parents felt it was a better life. They were not wrong.
Well, there's some of the Army helicopters overhead now.
These are Bell Huey Iroquois choppers, the workhorse of the Vietnam War, still in active service in Australia. Wonderful piece of machinery. They saved lives, many, many Australian lives. They were used for medevac. Many of our diggers were pulled out of the jungle in here. It's a sound that produced the germ of a hit song. I was only 19, the thumping of the chopper. Nowadays, of course, we're updated. Nowadays, the Black Hawks, the front line of the Australian Army Helicopter Corps, are based here in Queensland. They're based not just too far north of where we are at the moment. Is there an old car anywhere in Australia that's not in this parade today?
There's some cadets, some Australian Army cadets, carrying the Australian flag.
Michael, perish the thought that if a war broke out for whatever reasons and Australia was again faced with the grim tasks of war, would young Australian men, do you think, turn up, volunteer in the same numbers that they did?
Well, people were saying in 1939 that they would. And they were saying, and it looked likely, that people just wouldn't be involved, that they had been scarred by war in 20 years earlier and that they weren't going to be much involved again.
Michael, can I interrupt you for a moment? Just to mention this band. This is the Corporoo Fife and Drum Band, and the school from which this band was formed was formed in 1876, and this band was actually formed in the 1940s and took part in the first Victory Parade of 1945.
Oh, isn't that? That's terrific.
Fantastic link with history.
But just going back to that, I would say, you know, depending on what the circumstances were and so on, and we were talking before about the interest, the enthusiasm and the knowledge that young people have about our military past, I don't think there's any reason to say that they wouldn't. Australians have been challenged and they've met the challenge before. This is a profoundly wonderful country, and I think a sense of country and a patriotism and a love of country is growing. And, you know, things looked pretty black in 1940 and they responded to the challenge then. And I don't see why we would say that they wouldn't do so today.
Now, these are the home front veterans. What do they mean by that, Michael?
Well, John Curtin said that the war would be won at the battlefront, of course, but also in the factories and on the farms in Australia, that all Australians had a part to play. He spoke of an all-in war effort, and everybody, really, from 1942 onwards, was very closely involved. It was... nobody didn't have a role. Children, women, young people, workers of all types, they all had something to say, something to do during this totally involving all-in war effort.
Now here's a 1940s fire appliance, they're calling it here. Fire truck.
So the phrase all in, Michael, it had a certain resonance. And of course it does for you because you're the author of the book. I recommend it strongly. It's a very good read. Dr. Michael McKernan's All In takes its name from Curtin's phrase. All in, everyone had to fight the war. It's a great read about what happened in Australia on the home front.
And an honour to have you here with us today.
Well,
Dr. McKernan?
It's a delight to be here. And, I mean, did you just think of what people were doing? I was saying to you before we came on air that all of the camouflage nets made in Australia, I mean, it might seem a small point, every single camouflage net made in this country was made by volunteer labour, boys and girls and women, and that's a heck of a lot of knot tying, and that's what they did.
Well, we're seeing the home front veterans now, so on that note, let's go to a break and come back to us to celebrate and commemorate victory in the Pacific 50 years on.
We are witnessing the home front celebration. Well, of course, the home front embraced a great deal. It was the mums and dads who were knitting. You know, during the war, knitting took off as an enormous occupation. In fact, it's recorded in Hansard, the official proceedings of the Australian Parliament, that a member in there once was knitting. He was knitting for the troops. It took over as a mass movement.
You heard it here first.
And the ration was in fact lifted. The ration on wool was lifted so that people could get on with that industry that you're talking about, because it just did so much for the morale of people to get something home handmade.
The Pacific Islanders, rich in tapa cloth. The war brought vast change to the Pacific. I'm thinking particularly of the Solomon Islands, where they went from an idyllic island paradise existence to brutal warfare, quickly, very quickly. In a matter of 6 months or so, Americans were pushing out the Japanese on the island of Guadalcanal. All nations represented here today.
There's about 12 nations, I believe.
Bangladesh Association of Brisbane. Bangladesh, of course, saw much action with the Japanese push to try and take India, and there was much fighting in the area. Michael McKernan? I guess we saw General Slim's group fighting in that area in Bangladesh, so the memories would be there for them as well.
Yeah. Indeed there would, and of course, speaking of Slim, he then became an Australian Governor-General. A very, very Australian-like soldier, if we can say so, a man who appealed to Australians enormously because he was matter-of-fact, down-to-earth, and a soldier's soldier, I think. Because the war gave Australia such an enormous fright. We seemed in the dark days of early 1942 so alone and so small that all Australians really did embrace the immigration program that arose after the war, the results of which we're seeing today, because of that feeling of smallness and the need to build this nation up. And the fact that it's grown in such significant size, I mean 7 million people during the Second World War, what, 18 million people now? In 50 years, that's a very impressive growth. And these people, of course, have not only been to war, they've seen incredible change in their society, haven't they, over the years of the 50 years of peace. And they've accepted that change, and they should be celebrated for that too, I think.
And relief for so many of them. The war experience was, of course, highly individual, very different for very many people, but for very many of what became known as new Australians, those who came here in that post-war migration push, it was a better life, it was a better place. But I often wonder, you know, their first taste of Australia, it may well have been in their own country, with a bloke with a slouch hat.
Yes, yeah, that is very likely. And what I found on the pilgrimages this year, and all the places we went to, one of the really impressive things were how pleased people were to see Australians back again. We were in Greece, and the welcome there, particularly in Crete, was just remarkable. I mean, they're not people of great richness, but they're people who were very, very pleased to see the Australian diggers back again.
Here the youth are represented in the march. We've got primary school students, followed by the secondary school students. I think we've got 500 of each. Nice to see the kids getting involved.
It's a day they'll remember. They'll remember it forever.
Enjoying that ticker tape, aren't they?
Well, they're ankle deep, you could say.
Might have lost a few of them then somewhere.
And it is ankle deep, isn't it?
It's just remarkable.
It's a great deal of tape.
Still coming down from the city buildings here.
It's interesting though, you know, talking about kids. When I was in Japan last week, I did a live cross, that is to say I talked live on a television in Australia, and afterwards quite a few young kids, 12 or so, Japanese kids came up and talked to the interpreter. They said, "What's this bloke doing?" The interpreter said, "He's broadcasting in Australia about Hiroshima Day." And they said, "Oh, why are Australians interested in that?" The interpreter said, "Well, of course, we were at war." 12-year-old Australian kid, Japanese kids had no idea Australia had actually been in the war. I thought that was sad, very, very sad.
Here are the secondary school students coming through now. Well, here we are in Brisbane, celebrating Australia Remembers.
And on they march, the serried ranks of rememberers. The organisers here are telling us that they had no idea there'd be a roll-up like this, but no real problems. Well, no real problems, except the crowd's about 4 times bigger than they thought it'd be.
All the support personnel, you can't see them, they're off camera, but they're standing right back. They don't need to do anything. The crowd is beautifully controlled. And all those school students are holding the Australia Remembers logo, which has been a huge success, hasn't it?
It has. It was fascinating. It was interesting, wasn't it, to talk earlier to the Walsh family at the centrepiece of the logo.
And we must point out that there's that 4th daughter.
Yes, there is. Yes, all the kids were there. The 5 Walsh kids were there when their dad, Ray, arrived back in Sydney. But of course, the photographer snapped just the tight shot, so we didn't see all the rest of them, but they all have their memories of it. Irene Moxie, the eldest daughter, she tells a fascinating story about after he'd arrived back a month or so, he took the kids into town, into Sydney, to do some shopping, and a plane came over, and just instinctively he grabbed the kids, shoved them into the gutter and jumped on top of them. Of course, the kids thought it was all a game. But for Ray Walsh, a digger like so many diggers returned, the sounds of war would remain with him for quite some time.
The sounds of war are going to stop in a moment. We're going to go to 2 minutes silence at midday to remember those who didn't return from the war.
Siren to remember.
Ladies and gentlemen, please observe 2 minutes silence nationally in memory of those who gave the supreme sacrifice so that we may live in freedom.
17, our frontline fighter. And it breaks the silence of memory. 2 minutes. 2 minutes in which Australia paused as we remembered great sacrifice, but we remember this day, most of all, victory. Michael McKernan is an historian from the Australian War Memorial. Michael, why do we observe 2 minutes silence?
It was an Australian journalist, Dennis, Edward George Honey, who was in Britain when the First World War broke out, and he enlisted with the British troops and served throughout that war. At the end of it, he decided that there should be an empire-wide pause on Armistice Day so that everyone would remember the awful cost of war. He approached the London newspaper, the Evening Standard, and suggested a 5-minute silence. This was tested out with the Grenadier Guards and they found that it was too long, but the King, just before the Armistice Day 1919, issued a proclamation calling on the 2-minute silence to be observed. It was observed throughout the Empire then, at this man's suggestion, and has been observed ever since. And it really is something that's become a very significant part of the way we commemorate our war dead, that every year we will set aside some time to remember them and their sacrifice.
Very powerful here today. The whole mood of the place changed, and you had thousands of people with heads bowed. Complete change of mood.
Yes, indeed.
And a scene replicated right across Australia. The government urges to pause for those 2 minutes, and it would be a churlish heart which would not do so.
I think as Frank showed earlier too, those little crosses that are at Anzac Parks and in front of the war memorials around the country, that certainly has illustrated, for me particularly, the sacrifices that were made in war, and that this, while it is a celebration, certainly is a commemoration.
I think the Australian way of commemoration has always been to focus on the individual. If you think of the National Roll of Honour and the Australian War Memorial, we are the only nation to record the name of every man and woman who has died in the service of this country. And that's something I think we should be very proud of. It's also something that's always been part of Australian commemoration, that every person lost in war is precious to us, to the family, of course, initially, but to the nation. And we have always concentrated on the names of those individuals. They've always been remembered and known individuals. And those crosses, that field of remembrance that you spoke of, Christine, is just one further example of that. And the interesting thing with the unknown Australian soldier at the memorial, that began a tradition at the memorial that has continued on. And that is, as families come to visit the memorial and to see the Roll of Honour, they've begun to place red poppies against the names of those who particularly mean something to them. And you'll see now the Roll of Honour festooned with those red poppies. And I think that's a delightful addition, that there are still families there for whom those names mean something personal. And Australian commemoration has always been personal.
We urge people to go to the Australian War Memorial. It's a very special place. Michael, as you pointed out to me, of the 110,000 names in that Roll of Honour, no rank is listed at all.
Without rank or decoration, they are in death, all men are equal, all men and women are equal, and so it's done, but on the battalion, the ship's company or the squadron, organised by that, because that's what they wanted to be part of.
We're looking at our main battle tank. This is the Leopard, and it's quite an expensive piece of technology. Australia, by its very terrain, the hot, dry, dusty country, requires special mechanised effort in warfare, and it's something that our engineers have become very, very good at. This is an APC, an armoured personnel carrier. You jump in the back, it's as noisy as could be. When you jump out, you're right in the middle of a firefight. At least that was the experience of our blokes in Vietnam.
Here we're certainly seeing the military might behind that. 2 Unimog trucks towing a 105 hoister. What's that all about, Michael? I'm reading it, I don't understand it.
Dennis is our defence expert.
Okay, Dennis, come on, what's a Unimog truck?
Well, a Unimog is a multiple geared truck, and the effect of it is that it can really go through any terrain at all, even underwater. It can actually go through about 6 foot of water. The point about it is that all the bits that need to be dry are placed above the 6'5" mark. It's a very important point. Armies these days roll on equipment, however high-tech it may be.
And those are the hoisters, are they?
A 20-cent washer can ruin the whole day for all of them. But Australian has equipped itself quite remarkably and quite sensibly in the post-war days. That's actually a collection of rifles, of fighting rifles going back. These days, the main battle weapon that we use for our infantry is, of course, the Steyr rifle, and they're made in Lithgow in New South Wales. Just looking at those howitzers, those mobile cannons. Their predecessor, of course, was a gun very, very famous with Australians, the 25-pounders. And at RSL clubs right across Australia, you'll see 25-pounders out the front. But here's a point. The Battle of the Kokoda track, the Japanese were turned around at a place called Imita Ridge, and they were turned around because our diggers dragged up a 25-pounder. They humped up these enormous guns all the way to Imita Ridge, and that really was a decisive turning point in that battle.
And when you look at the pictures of that, Dennis, and then you go and look at the gun itself, you just wonder how it was moved. I find the bringing the military might into this parade interesting. We've had a couple of hours, I suppose, of the veterans marching. And this just reminds us, I think, again, that the Australian way of commemoration is not to emphasise our military might or our technological superiority, as you see in those Eastern European parades that we saw so much of in the communist era. Our way has been to focus on the people and what they did, less the military equipment, the hardware.
It was fascinating on the pilgrimages earlier this year. Very often the diggers would travel with us, of course, as our honoured heroes. But also there were invariably some from the Defence Forces themselves.
These men we're seeing now, 30 personnel dressed as air raid wardens. What was the role of the air raid warden?
Well, Australians, like everyone else, were very concerned about the possibility of the air war and bombing, and Australia dug trenches. But perhaps we ought to go to Frank, because he looks as though he's got somebody he's going to talk to about that.
There's been one person who hasn't made a sound during this entire procession, and here he is standing right here. His name is Chris Marshall. He's a CUO with the 129 Regional Cadet Unit. He's been standing here as stiff as a ramrod, has not flinched or moved for about the last 3 hours, and I'm darn sure he's not going to do it now. But a very proud young man who's been just another player in the VP 50 celebrations today. Hasn't moved a muscle. There he is, perhaps we could say the face of the future on VP Day in 1995. Back to you on the studio.
Good on you, Frank. It was interesting as we travelled through the battlefields of the Second World War to talk to the old blokes and them exchange their experience with the younger generation of Australia's soldiery. And I use that word advisedly because there were many young women amongst the Australian soldiers who travelled with us, because it's a much different defence force these days. But at the end of it all, we were talking. And one of the old fellows said to me, he said, if there's nothing else I'd like these young people to take away from us, it's our pride in service. They were volunteer soldiers, not there of choice, as were the young people, the young soldiers who travelled with us. Well, I think they learned that lesson. I think they learned that lesson well. Great deal of pride, and this day, great deal of dignity too, as we remember.
And there they are. The parade's over now, and everyone's milling into the streets. And it certainly reminds me of the scene of Brisbane back 50 years ago, doesn't it? When everyone did spill out into the streets, and people were saying you couldn't cross Queen Street because it was so busy. But let's go to a break as we look at everybody renewing acquaintances and enjoying the ticker tape. And we'll see you after the break. Back to Brisbane, and the parade has finished now. It's the end of the celebrations, the official celebrations and commemorations of victory in the Pacific. And 50 years on, I think Brisbane has done itself proud. Dennis Grant is with me, and Dennis, what an extraordinary sight today, and still milling around. People just don't want to go home, and they don't want to lose the celebratory feeling, do they?
I wouldn't have missed this for absolute please. It was a fabulous feeling to be here. This crowd was alive. Many, many, many more people here than were expected. I don't know what the rest of Brisbane's doing, because they're all just just here. But the atmosphere down there, look, you could have packaged it and sold it. It was just fantastic. As Brisbane is the focus for the National March, and today Brisbane has done its own people proud. Now, Frank Warwick, you were down there, you were on the in amongst it. I was a bit worried about you. I thought those old dears were going to bundle you off at one point.
Weren't they fantastic? It was a real buzz. Just so many people down there, and the spirit was so good. It was very hard because we only had a few seconds really to do each cross, but there were people just yelling backwards and forwards from the crowd to the marchers and the veterans who were in the vehicles, the disabled veterans. It was really quite touching. And perhaps one of the things I had meant to mention but didn't get around to it was the fact that there were so many people who played a major role in the war effort who never wore a uniform. There were the people who work back here, many of whom wanted to sign up but weren't allowed to because they had to keep the wheels turning at home. And I know they deserve a special mention. The amount of ticker tape that's been distributed around the place is absolutely extraordinary. I don't know whether our cameras can go across behind Dennis onto the front of the Commonwealth Bank. Maybe you've already seen this, but over there it looks as though we've had a snap frost actually, because dangling and festooned off the different levels, off the windows, there it is, off the trees in front, it really looks as though we've had a Stanthorpe type snap frost about 7 below, and it looks like little icicles, and that's like that all the way up the street. As you could see, and I could hear you talking about, it was ankle deep, and in places it was knee deep. Extraordinary, and the feeling is good. I don't think there's going to be much work done around town this afternoon.
Well, Dr. Michael McKernan from the Australian War Memorial is with us, and I can see a role for the Australian War Memorial for years to come when you see the enthusiasm.
I agree with you entirely. I mean, I think when the Australia Remembers program was being considered and you know, proposed and all those sorts of things, there was a lot of scepticism. People saying, look, you know, don't overdo it, don't try to oversell it. People, they don't want to be involved in that. And it's just been a big thing like this today has been fantastic. I mean, the involvement of this entire city. But this has been replicated, you know, all around the country, in the smaller towns and all around the country. People have been coming together in their own way to do their own thing. And I think that the people who put Australia together, Australia Remembers together, should feel very proud of their activities. It's been hard work. There's been a lot of people contributing on a volunteer level. Most of it's been done by state advisory committees that came together. They haven't been paid, and they've just been community-minded people, and lower down level at the community level too. And they deserve, I think, a terrific pat on the back. I mean, the people who put this together have been largely a volunteer group, and my goodness, they must have been working hard.
Well, I know that, Dennis, you spoke to the Prime Minister yesterday and you asked him what happens now after VP 50. Will it die down, or will there be commemorations for years to come? And what did he answer?
Well, he had a very strong view about this. He said there are a number of layers to this. The first one was, and he lays claim to some personal triumph in this regard, and I think it's not entirely out of court to applaud him for it, but it's this. First of all, it was a process of raising the understanding amongst the younger community, so that we actually knew what our granddads and grandmas and mums and dads, what they actually did during the war. I think that objective has been met during the Australia Remembers year. But the other one was, it was terribly important that we don't forget. And that's why the government is proposing some sort of renewed emphasis at the Australian War Memorial. That's the national focus. We've spent a great deal of time talking about this. But what this day says to me is that Australians everywhere, tiny little bush towns, big cities like this, today they just will not forget. Australia remembered and did it well.
Some of the people that we shouldn't forget, actually, Frank spoke to. Frank, tell us about these amazing people you came across.
Christine, there were so many of them. There were so many contributors to the Aussie war effort who boosted morale in ways it's often easy to overlook. People like 79-year-old Lorraine Leadbeater.
Well, it was a beach beauty contest, 1940 to 41. And I didn't know about it, actually, but my brother, who took the picture, knew about the contest, and he said, I want to enter you. Well, it went for about a year, or with girls entering all the time each week. And as I said, I think 8,000 girls were entered, and I won for the week. And then a little later, they chose the state winners, and I won for Miss Queensland.
Was the picture taken by your brother?
Yes, the picture was taken by my brother and sent down.
So it appeared in Pix magazine, and then what happened?
Well, the letters started to flood in then. Shortly after this was in, the letters started to come in bit by bit, and then they got more and more and more until I was absolutely flooded with them. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
Well, here's one. It comes from a Sergeant F. Day of the Middle East. He says, "Dear Miss Lorraine, I hope you don't think me too forward in writing to you, a complete stranger, but I hope not for long. It all started through an Aussie leaving your photo from an Australian magazine pinned up on the wall of the dugout I took over." Is that sort of typical of a letter she got?
Yes, that's right. And some of the soldiers said to me, "You'd be amazed if you knew where your picture was pinned up."
Now, what's this picture of you here with writing all over you?
Well, see, that was cut out of the magazine by one of the soldiers, or some, and they thought it would be rather nice to write all over me so that they would have their names down and I would probably write to them.
But you ran out of time to write letters, so then Pix magazine published a letter from you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I asked them if they would do it because I couldn't cope with all the letters that were coming in by the dozen. The postman was nearly frantic.
To sum it up, I suppose, your war effort was to try to cheer the soldiers up no matter where they were.
Yes, that was the effort, the purpose, to try and cheer them up, because they mostly said they were lonely and they were attracted by that picture and thought I seemed a friendly type of person, I think.
Lorraine, I'm sure that there are some people who are wondering whether any of the letters were naughty, dirty.
No, never. Never one. No, there wasn't. They were all very, very nice.
Thank you, Lorraine. Well, of course, the pin-up girls are well known, but a competition for pin-up blokes? Yes. He was a sergeant, actually, from the 2nd 7th Cavalry Regiment, and his name was Bill Morgan.
The competition was run by the Pix magazine, and I understand its name was the best smile in the AIF.
And how did you come to be entered into it?
Because my sister was responsible for my entry in the competition.
She took the picture?
She took the picture as far as I know.
And nominated you?
And nominated me.
Where were you when you found out that you'd won?
I was in Egypt.
And how did you find out about it?
Because everybody in the regiment told me. Because they could read probably more assiduously than what I could.
Well, how?
And there was lots of rubbishing, Frank. Well, they used to say, "Ha ha, Morgo, there you are again."
And you copped heaps, did you?
Oh, copped heaps, yes.
But you were there.
I was there.
And you're still smiling.
And I'm still smiling, yes.
Good on you, Bill. What a great character. By the way, he just had a round with his doctor for sun cancer. He hadn't been hit by his wife, Claire. Many great showbiz careers, of course, were born in the legendary wartime concert parties which took the minds of the troops off the experiences they'd been through or what perhaps lay ahead of them. Whatever the direction of their post-war lives, there are many treasured memories like those of 71-year-old Mavis Donovan.
Well, there was 3 units, the Stars and Stripes Review, which I was in, the Variety Stars and the Great Levant, and it took 3 weeks to go around to all the different camps. They were mainly open-air camps, homemade ones, sometimes just sort of bits of wood nailed together for just a platform on the stage. Occasionally that we'd go into a hall, but only very occasionally. There's a comedian and there was a lot of sight acts like magicians and tumblers and singers. I was in the ballet and on odd occasions I got in front of the ballet as a soubrette and I really thought I had it made at that particular stage.
What about the Americans? We've heard they were oversexed, they're overpaid and they're over here.
Well, yes, I suppose. I know that was a fact and a lot of people, thought I was a bit of a hussy, the way I was always had Americans at my home, but it was not like that at all. It was just that we wanted to give them a home away from home and they really appreciated it. When they first came over, my father said, "Now don't go bringing any Americans home here," and because the first day I met some and brought them home and they changed their mind.
Did you experience or witness any of the public animosity towards the American servicemen?
Yes, I did. A lot of the boys, our boys, well, I suppose you couldn't blame them in a way because as soon as the Americans came over, they went off with their girlfriends.
They were pretty stroppy?
Yeah, they were. I can always remember that big fight in Adelaide Street when they got stuck into one another there. It was terrible.
And that's you?
That's me, yes.
You were a good looker.
Oh, wish I looked like that now.
But now, the wonderful thing is that here we are celebrating 50 years after VP Day, and you haven't retired yet.
No, and I don't think I ever will. I think I'll die on the stage, I think.
What do you call yourselves now?
The Galloping Grandmas. There was 9 of us to start off with. There's 7 of us now that dance. But it was really only just Joan and I, and we do all the hospitals and stroke victims and pensioner clubs and anybody that asks.
Are you marching to commemorate the 50th anniversary?
Well, I would love to march, but we had already said that we would do a Australia Remember show at St Martin's Hospital over at Tagum, and we have already promised, and they would be disappointed if we didn't turn up.
So, if not marching, the grannies certainly will be galloping.
That's right, we'll still be galloping.
And all the best out there at St Martin's at Tygum. I'm sure you had a wonderful time today with the Galloping Grandmas. A million stories like that with people who were involved in the war.
You've met some wonderful characters today. Thanks very much for that, Frank.
My pleasure.
Well, it's still very electric, the atmosphere here. Everyone's milling around. The sun's come out. The parade's over, but there's a lot more fun to be had today. We're going to go to the break.
Which one would you like?
Okay, you're back in Brisbane. The parade has finished for the victory in the Pacific commemorations, 50 years on, and the crowd's dispersing a little, but there you can see them milling around the Boston bomber. And Dr. Michael McKernan's with me now. What was the relevance of the Boston bomber before? Who found out about that? Frank, you knew about the Boston bomber.
I had a yarn to them. That's one that they're restoring out at Amberley. It's made up of parts of a couple of them, including the one that was lifted by helicopter out of the swamps in Papua New Guinea. It won't fly again. And I was talking to them. Remember when that chopper shot, when it lifted the plane out, we saw the propeller actually spin after 50 years of lying in the sludge. It wasn't the whole motor turning. The motor had seized. That's why it crashed. A bullet had gone through the oil line. The motor had seized, and it seized so suddenly that the prop sheared off. So the prop actually was spinning when it came out, but it was only the prop and not the motor. A fascinating little insight to the way that aircraft there has been reassembled.
And you could see some of that camouflaging just at the back there. And Michael, you were saying that all the camouflaging was made here in Australia.
I was talking about the camouflage netting.
The netting,
yeah, and that was all made in Australia, all by volunteer effort. And I really wanted to talk about that in the context of everybody having a role. I just think it's terrific that people were so engaged with the defence of their country that even small things like that they wanted to be part of.
Now, I understand we're going to cross down and give you a look at the Sydney procession in just a couple of minutes' time, and we're going to stay with that until 1 o'clock, which is the time for the National Commemorative Service, which is being held here at Anzac Square and the Shrine of Remembrance. So we'll be coming back to that at 1 o'clock, and that will then be going out to Australia to see that as the National Commemorative Service. And I'm not finished here either. I'm going to come back here and do the news from here tonight, from in front of City Hall, which will be all illuminated with the massive V for Victory sign, so I'll be back here again tonight.
Frank, I just wanted to say that I've been hugely impressed with Brisbane today. Brisbane, the city, have embraced Australia Remembers, and they've done it brilliantly. They've done the nation, they've done all of Australia proud today. They've taught us something. They've taught us how to remember.
Well, we banana benders like to enjoy life. If there's something worth celebrating, we like doing it.
Well, this certainly was worth celebrating, wasn't it? Not just here, but right across the country.
So that's just about it. There are a lot of celebrations going on in town. There's the big Cutting the Rug show, which is on in City Hall tonight, and various other festivities. So we've got to say goodbye from Brisbane and stand by to join the Sydney March in just a couple of moments' time.
Okay, here's Sydney.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Well, it's the young people. It's been overwhelming.
VP Day. And I know that the fighting, of course, was very savage in the Pacific Islands. A lot of islanders lost their lives. I was reading just today how in Papua New Guinea alone, I think 15,000 people from Papua New Guinea lost their lives during the war. A tremendous sacrifice that was made by them.
Yes. Do you think, Richard, right that we recognise those people for the role they played in helping us win the war?
I mean, we've recognised them to a certain extent, but I notice also that some of them are saying, perhaps a little bit of compensation for the help we gave you. But certainly very gallant, very brave people, and they paid a very, very high price.
And today is a very good day for...
well, to repay in part at least some of that bravery and generosity of spirit that they showed towards us.
Richard, what about the prisoners of war when they came home to Australia? How were they recognised and how did they assimilate back into the Australian lifestyle?
Well, some assimilated quite readily, but a lot, of course, found it very difficult to actually get over the experience. It's interesting, I think, that in some ways it is the prisoner of war who's the dominant figure that represents the Australian experience of the war, in a way quite different to the First World War, where it was the sort of more heroic Anzac who was out there fighting.
Well, you'd think that no one in Sydney on August 15th, 1945 would have anything on their minds other than celebrating the end of the war. But Norma and Ted Whitney did have something else to do. By coincidence, they chose that day to get married.
Well, just looking at the photo now and thinking back, you did look pretty smart in that frock.
Well, that was 50 years ago, Ted.
Whenever Ted and Norma Whitney celebrate their wedding anniversary, they have no trouble recalling the date, August 15, 1945. It was a coincidence that doubled their joy but threatened to derail the wedding party. Ted discovered the war was over when he rang to confirm the arrangements and heard Prime Minister Ben Chifley announcing Japan's surrender.
It was coming through on the phone line of a public phone in the street. I don't know, but it was the first I knew that the war was over, and I kind of thought we might have a few problems with the celebrations today.
Despite the instant holiday, the florist and photographer came through, but finding a sober driver was a major challenge. From the church at Wallara to the city photo studio, they ran a gauntlet of crowds wild with joy, their car in real danger of being overturned.
Crowds were just so thick, they were laying on the car, top of the car. They were lifting the car up, carrying it along with us in it.
Ted and Norma shared the excitement, but they still needed a police escort through King's Cross.
3 of them got around the car because they were a little bit afraid in the excitement we might get tipped over. They were leaning in the windows. It was just so exciting.
Once it was over, it was good to look back on. But while it was on, you know, we were a bit dubious, but it was not over-perturbed.
The Whitneys survived and managed to begin married life with that best of wedding gifts, peace.
It was our wedding day, but the whole world was celebrating because it was peace in the Pacific, and that was a joy for the whole world.
What a wonderful day to get married on. Certainly no excuses for missing the anniversary, were there?
Absolutely not. And congratulations to them for their wedding anniversary today.
Absolutely. Richard, a lot of talking about weddings, talking about getting married, a lot of Australian women, of course, married American servicemen. I think some 12,000.
Yes, about 12,000 Australian women went off to America, and about 6,000 women from other places were brought back by Australian troops too.
What effect did the American troops have on Australia at that time, apart from taking away a large number of women?
That was, I think, in some ways the main